Hi, this video is derived from a hands-on wet lab and seminar that was hosted by Cornell University and the University of Maine for a group of goat breeders who wanted to learn about artificial insemination and how to use it on their farms. My name is Jim Weber. I'm a veterinarian and a faculty member and an associate professor in the School of Food and Agriculture at the University of Maine. I teach and do research in an animal and veterinary science program at UMaine. This particular video will go over, what I'd like to do is go over how to use hormones and different types of drugs to synchronize the timing of AI, artificial insemination, through manipulation of the goat's hormones and thus her estrus cycle. I want to not only talk about the different drugs that we use, but get a little bit into how those drugs work and how they basically fool the doe into thinking that it's time to ovulate an egg and to come into estrus and show heat to a buck. I also want to talk a little bit about the drugs themselves. Whenever we put drugs into animals that are potentially food animals or giving us food products like meat or milk, we need to think about drug residues. And I want to spend a little bit of time as a veterinarian about that because there's some interesting implications for use of certain reproductive drugs in goats. Okay, let's start off with some basic reproductive physiology. Goat is what's called a polyestrous species. Goats have an estrus cycle, humans have a menstrual cycle. It's got some very similar, a lot of things in common, but there are some differences. So in a goat, they're seasonally polyestrous, and we'll talk about that later, is they tend to be what's called short day breeders. They breed in the fall as the day length is getting shorter from the summer solstice until the winter solstice. So we'll typically see a goat may be fertile, a doe may be fertile from September until January. It all depends on species. Some animals, breeds are more seasonal than other ones, and some are less, and you can breed them much of the year. But anyway, within that period when the goat is actively cycling and going through multiple estrus cycles, that's polyestrus, is one after another. What we're showing here basically is here's a cycle that ends in ovulation. So this is the last part of one cycle. And then here's a complete cycle that again, at the end of estrus, ends in ovulation. Here's the start of another cycle. So let's look at the period from one ovulation to another ovulation. In general, in the goat, we're looking at around a 21-day cycle. That may vary based on individuals. Some goats are a little bit longer, some are shorter, but this is pretty much the average. The goats go through several different stages. And again, the hormones are changing during these stages. You can see this is a hormone called estradiol. It's a type of estrogen. And this is produced by the ovary of the goats. It comes out of the ovarian follicle that bears the egg. You notice as the goat gets closer to ovulation, her estrogen levels go way up and they peak right before ovulation. This is very important in terms of why the goat actually shows behavioral estrus or shows heat signs or is receptive to the buck. And that's all has to do with estrogen, its effects on both her reproductive tract and her brain. At the same time as estrogen is going from a fairly low level, and what's happening here is ovarian follicles are growing larger and larger, and they're doing what we call ripening. They're becoming mature and getting ready to ovulate. They produce lots of estrogen. At the same time, another ovarian component, something called the corpus luteum, we'll talk about in a minute, which actually came from the follicle that was producing estrogen the previous cycle. So if you look at this cycle, we have a peak of estrogen here, and then estrogen stops at the time of ovulation because the follicle ovulates and disappears. That follicle actually regroups, rearranges itself, and becomes another organ called a corpus luteum, which produces another hormone called progesterone. And progesterone So again, it's basically the same structure, changes its stripes, goes from estrogen here to progesterone here in the next cycle. And sorry about that. And it peaks maybe 5, 6, 7 days after ovulation. Progesterone has a number of effects, one of which is it keeps a goat doe out of estrus. So goats that have a lot of progesterone but not a lot of estrogen will not be receptive to a buck. Okay. The other thing about progesterone and the organ that's producing them, the corpus luteum, is that the corpus luteum is designed after it's produced here right after ovulation. It's designed to self-destruct. Okay, kind of a weird thing, but this is the organ that makes this a 21-day cycle. Okay, it goes up to a maximum amount of progesterone here. It kind of stays stable for a while. And then there's factors within the uterus of a non-pregnant doe which destroy the corpus luteum, and progesterone stops being produced. And look, it goes down. And once the negative influence of progesterone on estrus behavior and estrogen production goes away, this is called luteolysis. Basically, the corpus luteum is destroyed, so it's luteolysis. At that point, the follicle, which has been sort of growing very slowly during this phase because it's being inhibited by progesterone, all of a sudden starts growing and produces estrogen. So again, just like in this previous cycle, we get a very quick rise in estrogen. We get what's called proestrus and estrus, and these are the behavioral estrus periods when we're going to see a goat doe in heat, and it's going to get more and more pronounced as she gets closer to ovulation. At this point, she'll accept the buck, and then we get another ovulation, and then the whole cycle starts again. So again, basic reproductive physiology, but important to know because we use some of these hormones, for example, progesterone, to synchronize the reproductive cycles of a number of different goats. You walk into a barn and goats are ovulating. Let's say this is today, a goat will ovulate tomorrow, the next day, the next day, the next day. And you got 22 goats and they're evenly distributed throughout here, just random. What we're trying to do is take that whole population of goats at this point and drive them so that somewhere in the future here, let's say maybe here, a couple of weeks later, all of the goats are at this stage of the cycle instead of being sort of randomly dispersed throughout this period. So that's basically the key thing you need to know about synchronization is we're trying to artificially shorten this cycle in a number of goats so that they all basically have this loss of progesterone called luteolysis at the same time. And there's a really neat way that happens. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. So again, just to see what's going on, and again, some people like a visual and some people like to see some words. So I'm going to go through this again. Progesterone is being produced for most of the estrus cycle. There's a hormone that comes from the uterus, produced by the uterine lining called prostaglandin, that causes that corpus luteum to regress in non-pregnant does. There's a whole other story in pregnant animals. There's actually something called maternal recognition of pregnancy that prevents this regression from happening and allows the pregnancy to keep going. It's kind of a neat thing. But once this happens and the progesterone producing organ is destroyed, progesterone levels go from very high to very low within a few hours. And that then causes increased production of two other hormones. And these are coming from the base of the brain. There's a little organ called the pituitary gland called follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And there's actually a drug that's commercially available that mimics this one. There's also a drug that mimics this one. There's a drug that mimics this one, okay? And what these do, follicle stimulating hormone, so it stimulates the hormone to grow, and luteinizing hormone actually causes the corpus luteum to form and ovulation to occur. So anyway, these hormones are given, are produced so that we can get to the final stages that happen right before ovulation when the doe is in heat. And again, what's happening during this period, not only with the follicles, but the brain of the goat is starting to go, okay, high estrogen, I should be receptive to the buck because this is the time I need to get pregnant. And this just shows some of the feedback and different things that are happening with progesterone. There's another hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone that comes out of the brain. Of FSH and LH we've talked about, they cause the follicles to develop, and then the follicle starts producing several hormones that eventually cause a large surge in this hormone called FSH, LH, which actually causes ovulation. So that's a little bit clinical and endocrinological, but it's important because if we actually look at the hormonal treatments on the same scale, the progesterone can be mimicked by a commercially available device called a CEDAR. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of CEDARs before, controlled intravaginal drug release. So what it does, it's a device that's actually put in as a pessary, a small little plastic thing that we insert into the vagina of the doe. All the does in a barn that you want to synchronize at the same time, we do that on the same day. And that controlled intravaginal drug release device, the drug it's releasing is progesterone. So here's your progesterone. When we leave this in for a number of days, and there's different protocols, you can leave them in anyways from 5 days to 14 days or even more. All the does in a barn, we leave these in. And when we pull the CEDAR, when we remove the CEDAR, the progesterone drops very similarly to what happens during luteolysis, when naturally the corpus luteum is destroyed. Okay, so really neat. We can actually make this happen whenever we want. And as long as the progesterone is in the animal, it thinks that it has a corpus luteum. So what's happening here is you've got a herd of does, you've put these into them, and you leave it in, let's say, for 14 days. During that 14 days, a number of does are going to go through natural luteolysis, and their natural progesterone levels are going to drop to 0. But we've still got a CEDAR in them, so their progesterone levels stay up at a level when they think they still have a CL, a corpus luteum, and they're producing progesterone. So all of a sudden, a doe that would have had luteolysis and ovulated 3 days after we put the CEDAR in doesn't ovulate. It just stays there in suspended animation. It stays in diestrus. And eventually, all the does in the herd go through natural luteolysis, and the only thing keeping them from ovulating is the progesterone in this CEDAR. Okay, very neat setup. It works quite well. So when we pull it, what ends up happening? The CEDAR causes an increase in a couple of hormones. Again, FSH and LH, the ones we talked about. Naturally, and especially during the breeding season in the fall, a lot of FSH and LH is released when we pull a CEDAR. Okay, within hours after the CEDAR comes out. In some cases, we give a drug called PG600. We'll talk about PG600 later. PG600 is a natural form of luteinizing hormone and FSH and follicular stimulating hormone. It's again, they're not exactly that, but they have those types of effects in goats. Okay, and what this does, it adds to the gonadotropins that may have happened when we pulled the CEDAR. And what it does is it increases it speeds up the maturation of the follicles, and sometimes it allows more follicles to actually ovulate than would have if we hadn't given the drug. This can be good in that if you're trying to breed a doe early in the breeding season, or let's say you have a system where you want to get does bred in the summer, well, you actually need to give PG600 after you pull a CEDAR in those cases for most goat breeds, because they won't naturally produce enough FSH and LH because it's not the season to breed. So we can, again, fool them into doing that. If you give the right amount of FSH and LH as in the form of PG600, you can get, singles and twins and maybe some triplets. If you give too much, you can actually get, large, a lot of quads and too many kids being born. So one important thing about PG600 is you need to work with a vet or somebody who's used it in your breed of goats and figure out what the dose is. You don't want to just give the standard dose to everything from pygmy goats all the way up to boar goats. Very important. So again, cedar is used in all cases. Some protocols for synchronizing sheep and goats will give estromate, which is a form of prostaglandin that's artificial, and estromate will actually make sure that it'll give you a slightly higher number of animals that respond to the removal of the cedar by going into estrus. It's not used in all protocols, but I feel that it increases the rate a little bit of animals that respond to the treatment and become synchronous. Okay, so we give this, maybe we'll give the estromate, we give the PG 600, especially if they're out of season. We get follicular development, we get a pre-ovulatory surge, we get behavioral estrus and ovulation, a very predictable time. So 20 goats, you do this treatment, you give the drugs, and pretty much all of those goats, if things work well, will come into heat on the same day. They'll come into estrus and they'll start showing, basically that they want to be bred by the buck. And later on, there'll be changes in their reproductive tract that you can actually monitor. We actually look at what's called cervical mucus, and we can then time ovulation to within just a few hours and get the semen at exactly the right time. And really what we want to do is get the semen in just a few hours before ovulation has occurred. And there's a way to do that. All right. So again, just, we can basically, the function of the CL can be sort of hijacked by implantation of this cedar. And again, one of the protocols that I've seen, you go 12 days in the doe, you remove it, we get luteolysis. And again, this 12-day cedar will outlast the natural corpus luteum of the doe. So, basically it'll keep progesterone going even after this natural luteolysis has occurred. And then eventually at some point out here, when all your does have gone through natural luteolysis, you pull the cedar and you get this same drop, except it's several days later. All right. So in general, if we look at the timing, when we pull a cedar, that's usually what we call day -1, where day 0 is the time of breeding. Okay, so if you want to breed a group of does by artificial insemination on a Monday, you would go in and pull the cedars on the Sunday before. And then you basically go back in your calendar 12 days and say that's when the cedar goes in. So 12 days in, pull the cedar. The next day, at some point, these animals are going to be in behavioral estrus. If we give the prostaglandin, the estromate, if we give the PG 600, the gonadotropin, that may increase the percentage of does that actually synchronize well and that show heat to the buck. It also can basically synchronize their estrus and their ovulation even closer than just the cedar alone. So one of the good things about using things like PG 600 or other gonadotropins is that it may end up, instead of being a 24-hour window when you should be breeding these does, it may be just a 6-hour window that you're looking at. In general, in does, estrus lasts between 24 and 36 hours. So, this doe is receptive to the buck and he will be breeding her during that entire period, maybe breeding her multiple times. Well, you just want to go in once and artificially inseminate this animal. It tends to be toward the end of this period. So what we tend to see is we pull the cedar, we start getting behavioral estrus 12 to 24 hours later, and probably about the end of 2 days after cedar removal, we're going to be seeing signs that we should be doing artificial insemination. This is just showing some of the equipment. I don't think I've shown it in some of the earlier videos. This is a package of 20 cedars, and these are actually what we call easy breed sheep cedars. They're not actually labeled for use in goats, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Within this bag, and these bags are dated, They're good for generally several years after you buy them, but they do have an expiration date. And they've got 20 of these little plastic units. And what this is a soft plastic. It's got two little wings. It's kind of T-shaped. These wings, there's a hinge right here for one wing and for the other wing. And you can actually bend these quite easily so they stand up straight. And this thing is just a long cylinder. Okay, on one end of them, there's a little bitty sort of tag on the end there. This cedar is actually in the wrong direction for going. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the correct way. So this cedar is actually set up to go into this inseminate or cedar applicator. You slide the little string coming out. There's actually a slot down the far side of this tube where that goes, so it's sticking out. This part goes into the tube, and these guys fold forward, so they actually go in. So when this thing is loaded, all you see is the tips of this and that sticking out right here. And at that point, your plunger has been pushed back, basically, so it's all the way back. And once that's in there, you put this into the dough. You insert this vaginally. We put a little bit of lube on the end of these, generally sterile lube, and it's inserted. And then basically you put your fingers here, you put your hand here, and you squeeze so that this piece of plastic meets up with this piece of plastic, and the plunger pushes the cedar in. Once it goes in the animal, the wings kind of flare out and they keep it from being dropped out. This little thing is hanging out the back of the dough, and it makes it easy for you to take out the cedar, 12 days later. This is a box that contains a bottle of a drug called estromate. Again, this is one of the prostaglandins that will work in goats, certainly. And this is a prescription drug. So again, this would have to be given at the, on the advice of a veterinarian who worked at your farm, so a veterinary client relationship. So again, very easy to put these in. They're non-invasive. Goats don't tend to mind having these put into them in most cases. It is easier to do this if the goat is restrained, for example, in a little clipping chute, or sometimes we'll put a number of goats into a milking parlor and put them into their stanchion side by side so that they can't move very much. Okay, the next thing I was going to show you is actually a straw full of semen, and in this case, this is an orange straw, and what I have here is I've actually got a little adapter and a syringe, and this straw was being used to actually draw up chilled semen that was collected from a buck, drawn into the straw, and is ready to be then loaded into an insemination gun. And I used an orange straw because it shows up really well once it's been put into the AI gun. So this gun is basically a stainless steel tube that goes from about here to there, and on the top it's got a little button. In the middle of the tube, again, is empty. There's a plunger that fits down into the tube with a little cap to push on with your finger. And that little plunger goes all the way to the end of the tube when this is depressed all the way. There's a sort of a little bit wider area that's been milled into this tube where the straw fits. So the straw goes in, it only goes in so far, and then it stops. And a little bit of the straw is going to stick out the end. When we actually thaw these straws out, and that'll be another part of the seminar series, we'll talk about thawing out straws and putting them into guns. We cut the end of the straw with a pair of scissors right here, so that there's a little airspace here. So the semen is from here over to what's called a wick. And this wick actually sits at the end of the straw. So the straw goes in. One more thing that happens is there's something called an AI sheath. And these are single-use, clean sheaths that come out of a clean package. They're not sterile, but they're clean. And we use only one per animal, so we don't cross-contaminate our does when we're breeding a bunch of does. And once the straw is in, we slide the sheath over and it locks into place. So there's a little button on here, and there's this little system for locking this in place. And once we press on the plunger is going to push this it's a little cotton, wad of cotton that's inside the straw. It's going to push this down the straw which is going to displace the semen, and it's going to come out the end of the straw into hopefully the mid-cervix area of the goat. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail in another talk. All right, one thing I wanted to mention as a veterinarian is I'm talking about a number of hormones and different types of drugs that are being used in goats and sheep. And a lot of what I just talked about actually goes for sheep also, some of these synchronization techniques. So CEDARs, there's actually a federal agency that regulates the use of food animal drugs to make sure that the residues, for example, from antibiotics don't end up in milk and meat. And there's some other drugs that we worry about that are given to animals routinely that, again, we don't want them ending up in the human food chain. There was a law that was passed back in 1994. It's the Animal Medical Use Clarification Act, AMDUCA. It allows veterinarians to permit what's called extra label drug use. They can write a prescription for a drug for a purpose that drug was not labeled for. So when a drug is labeled, it says this drug is labeled, we've tested it in dogs or we've tested it in goats, and we know it's safe in that species, and you can use that drug legally in that species. Veterinarians have a certain amount of latitude in that. It's called extra label drug use. The only uses for these, if to use a drug that's not in there, is if there's not a satisfactory, for example, antibiotic to treat an animal with pneumonia. You may use a drug that's not, if you've got a goat that's got pneumonia, you may use a drug that's not approved for use in goats that will cure that pneumonia and will do a good job on it. In those cases, we have to be very careful about the fact that that drug may spend a lot of time in that animal system and end up in a food product. So the veterinarian also has to talk to the owner about how long that drug, that any food or milk from that animal needs to be withheld before it can be put into the human food chain. And there's a whole process where the veterinarian can work with basically experts at the United States Department of Agriculture. You can also look up in something called the FARAD, which is the Food Animal Residue Avoidance Database. But this is a decision that a veterinarian needs to make. And one thing I just wanted to mention is, well, how does it work if we're using a drug extra label for reproductive purposes in goats? Okay, goats are a minor species. Unfortunately, most drug companies, when they get a drug approved by the federal government, don't want to go through the time and expense of testing that drug in goats, because it's a minor species in the United States. So the label doesn't include goats. There are actually drugs like the Easy Breed Cedar that are approved for use in sheep. So the drug company went and Zoetis went and actually got this approved in sheep, but they didn't do it in goats. So interestingly enough, in sheep, there's no meat or milk withdrawal period, but the cedar is non-prescription. It shouldn't be used in goats, but it is used in goats a lot. So again, understand this distinction. Cedars are not approved for use in sheep. By the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Estramate is a prescription drug. This is the prostaglandin we use after the cedar is pulled out. Again, it would require extra label use. A veterinarian would need to give you permission, basically written permission to use this, and would give you a withdrawal period. PG 600 is not approved for use in either goats or sheep. This is an interesting case because this is not a prescription drug. You can buy this on the internet. Even though it's a potent hormonal product, you can buy it on the internet without a prescription. But legally, you have to worry about residues of PG 600 in your food or milk products. So you really do need extra label authorization. You need a, basically withdrawal period for the drug. So it's kind of a interesting conundrum here. And the bottom line is that producers who use non-prescription drugs in unapproved species, and the goat is an unapproved species for all of these, need to be aware that they're responsible if illegal residues are found in their food products. If they're producing milk or cheese or meat, and it ends up in a, being tested by the federal government, which happens on a regular basis, and they come up positive for any of these residues, the federal government may come back with there's legal implications. So, as a veterinarian, I've talked to the folks at the at FARED about extra label use of drugs for therapeutic purposes and non-therapeutic purposes, and what they tell us basically is that the extra label use of medications like these for reproduction management would not be considered therapeutic and thus not permitted. So even if a veterinarian wanted to give you permission to use these extra label, the veterinarian couldn't get permission from the feds to do that. So you're really on your own. There's no approval that you have in writing that if your animal comes up with residues from any of these drugs. Let me go back just for a second here. That being said, we've talked about synchronizing estrus in animals, and some owners really don't want to use all these drugs on their animals. They would rather do a more natural process. They say, can we do this without actually, using CEDARs, using any of these other drugs? And I say, yes, you can, but it's more difficult. Synchronization is used because it concentrates labor. So you could actually take a herd of goats and go out twice a day with a buck on a halter and run the buck up to the fence next to the goats and see which goats came up and showed heat to him. Write those guys down, watch them for heat over the next day, and then you can sort of try to fine tune the timing of artificial insemination by watching something called cervical mucus. You actually go in with a speculum and a light, and you look at the cervix of these goats, and you look at the quality and the color and the cloudiness, basically the clarity of the cervical mucus. And when it gets to a certain amount, it's a good time for breeding. So you don't need any of these drugs to do that, but it takes a lot more work. So you may have a group of goats and you're doing this every day for 3 to 4 weeks. And then, you may have to go back again if you want to go through on a second cycle for the ones that didn't get bred. Also spreads out your kidding. So really depends what you want to do, those types of things. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a background on why we use drugs, to work with these goats and to synchronize estrus, and, what your choices are and kind of what the responsibilities you have, going out. On the internet, you can get a lot of these things. They're very easy to find and to buy. They're non-prescription, most of them. But again, I want to make it clear whenever I give a talk to sheep and goat owners, minor species, about the use of any kind of drugs, you've got to understand sort of, FARED and AMDUCA and what that means in terms of being a responsible owner. So anyway, hopefully that's a good background for that. Thank you.